Greetings and congratulations to the Canadian League of Rights for 50 years of trying to inform people about their opinions within the Canadian populace. I wanted to be with you today, and it's now Thursday evening, the 15th of October, and it appears clear that I won't be able to attend because I'm stuck here in Toronto in the midst of a Canadian human rights inquiry into Ernst Zundel's activities, if any, in regard to a website located in California. This activity has resulted in us bringing an application for judicial review of whether the Human Rights Tribunal has jurisdiction or whether the Commission had jurisdiction to demand the Human Rights Tribunal hold a hearing into a California website which is on the internet and not telephonic by any means. All these complications and costs are borne by an individual in this country, and I thought that it gave me an opportunity to share with you some thoughts on what's really going on in our country at this present time. It's as a result of this, of course, that I may have to be in Ottawa on Monday morning to cross-examine two witnesses on their affidavits so that the judicial review proceeding can continue, and hopefully a court can decide rather than the tribunal itself, who has declined to decide whether they ought to hear this case. They have deferred that consideration till the end of the case, which will be sometime in June 1998, after an enormous amount of money has been spent by Mr. Zundel to defend himself. In a way, it's important to recapitulate where we are now and what we're involved with in terms of freedom of speech in this country. A basic principle was once expressed in these words: resistance to oppression is obedience to God. A lot of people get uncomfortable when you speak about God, but I think all of us know that we have a desire to find the truth in our lives and in our time. It's one of the most fundamental drives of all human beings, and whether they recognize it as being originated by some divine concept within us, or whether they do not, it's a common universal characteristic we all share. It's also been said we must know our enemies. It's also been said, know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Well, what is the truth? What's going on here in Canada? Well, I think that since the Malcolm Ross decision in the Supreme Court of Canada, free speech has been in full retreat. A lot of people think we should tell ourselves jovial lies and pretend there are no problems, and that we should keep an upbeat attitude towards all these things, and thereby will encourage others to believe that the problem can be easily solved. Well, I think really that's a mistake. We should first of all be honest with ourselves about the significance and depth of this problem, and secondly, we should not convince ourselves the problem can be easily solved. First of all, we're confronted with a situation where the government has developed a very severe bias. CSIS, for example, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, has become the thought police. They have become, in essence, a form of left-wing dictatorship, or at least they're supporting that state of affairs. I think the Human Rights Commissions have become the new Inquisition. And I think, too, that CSIS and its supposed watchdog, CIRC, Security Intelligence Review Committee, are thoroughly out of control. This became clear as a result of the Heritage Front and what should have been called the Bristow Affair, but was conveniently sidetracked to be called the Heritage Front Affair. Rather than focus on the misdeeds of CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service tried to elaborate and increase the significance of the supposed threat, which Bristow himself had actually done a great deal to create, the supposed Heritage Front Affair. Just recently, I was able to watch a videotape of two CSIS officials, or agents, interviewing an aged German shopkeeper. My impression of that interview was that it was a subtle attempt to threaten the shopkeeper into never having meetings, such as he had had, for David Irving and others of the supposed right-wing persuasion. Well, Mr. Zundel got a copy of the videotape and complained about it because in the videotape, Peter and Angela, two CSIS agents, and I'm now quoting from the report of the Honorable Paul Gauthier, PC, QC, PC, as if there weren't enough initials behind his name to establish his credibility, He is a chairman of the board of the Security Intelligence Review Committee. In this brief report, he says that Peter said on October the 7th, 1996, in an interview with Michael Roth, in Toronto, Wolfgang Droger, the Heritage Front, has been much troubled by a group that calls itself ARA, Anti-Racist Action. This is a collection of anarchists, Trotskyists, Stalinists. Then Angela interrupts and says, the ARA that Peter described firebombed Ernst Zundel. I'm sure you've heard about the problem various leaders of the so-called right wing have received bomb threats. Well, notwithstanding the syntactic problems and grammatical errors of those statements, I think I'm correctly quoting them. It was my perception and observation seeing this that the attempt was being made to convince Mr. Roth that it was dangerous to associate with the right wing. Well, Mr. Zundel had three concerns because in the statements Peter had said that, or rather Angela had said, that the ARA had firebombed Ernst Zundel. So Ernst Zundel asked the following three questions. First of all, if the statement made by the CSIS agent was true or false. Secondly, whether the CSIS had informed the police about the identity of the arsonist. And finally, if ARA is a group that enjoys special protection from CSIS. In the course of the interview, Peter had also said, we're the political police, which actually I find to be more an accurate description than an inaccurate one, and essentially Mr. Gauthier condemns the agent for saying so, but in my opinion at least, it's an accurate description of what CSIS is now involved in, particularly when you consider the Thurston and Barbarash affidavit to obtain a search warrant, which clearly indicates that the RCMP were well aware of the activities of Thurston and Barbarash involving the distribution of a number of bombs and razor blades through the mail. But what do I find most difficult to accept in Mr. Gauthier's judgment? It is this, and I'm now quoting from page 6. He says, findings with respect to the reference to the political police. He says, quote, other than for that specific passage, quote, we're the political police, I find that the statements made by the same investigator indicate that he undertook the mandate of the service perfectly well. He was very clear that they represented the counterterrorism branch of the service, that his interest was only with the potential for violence related to activities within right-wing extremism. Do you understand what I'm saying? His interest was only with the potential for violence related to activities within right-wing extremism. Well, ARA has been involved in wrecking houses, in sending out parcels with bombs in them. At least people involved with the ARA have, Thurston and Barbarash. There is clearly an indication that this judgment implies that the only potential for violence rests with the right-wing extremism. I think that's a reflection both of the attitude of Mr. Gauthier, who finds nothing wrong with that, and with CSIS itself, which has this primary focus when in fact I don't think it's justified. The same attitude, I think, as I have expressed, has been expressed by the Parliamentary Committee, which is supposed to be the watchdog for CERC. And they, and at least in the minority report, condemned the attitude of CERC in investigating the Bristow activities. What we have then, in my view, is CSIS out of control, CERC basically apologizing and providing cover for CSIS, and an attitude that only the right wing is to be considered as a threat. This is what I would call left-wing totalitarianism. James Keegstra, Malcolm Ross, and Paul Fromm are three cases of supposed right-wingers, and what is their crime? Their crime is to speak. Their crime is to express their opinions. In the case of Malcolm Ross, his religious opinions outside of class. In the case of Jim Keegstra, his religious opinions basically inside of class. In the case of Paul Fromm, it's the expression of opinions not in class, not outside of class, but out of the province, in another province or another country. In the case of Paul Fromm in Canada, in Vancouver, it was to speak at a free speech conference. And in the state of Ohio, it was to speak at a funeral. The information provided to get Paul Fromm fired from his job was provided by the communist candidate in the last election from Salmon Arm, none other than David Lethbridge. So we now find, too, information that indicates that CSIS has been deceiving judges into getting wiretap warrants that are accompanied by basket clauses, which means that if I find evidence on a phone that I find interesting from a phone call that you make to somebody else, I can tap the phone of that somebody else and can go from there to the phone of somebody else to the phone of somebody else. These basket clauses are considered offensive to the principles of judicial scrutiny of activities of police. So in essence, CSIS, as I see it, is merely the puppet master for CERC, and the method of oppressiveness is becoming more and more serious as actual deeds of violence, like those done by the people in the Thurston and Barbarash warrant, or information to obtain the warrant, are being ignored, or at least not prosecuted. Bombs are being sent to the homes of people like Ernst Zundel, and their houses are being burned with impunity. And the activities of Mr. Gauthier tend to lend credibility to the view that the only danger comes from the, quote, right wing. What are the methods of this oppressiveness? Because I think we have to understand the methods in order to achieve some hope that we can overcome oppression. First of all, it's clear that the method is oppression, but the instruments are three. Isolate the person, alienate the person, and then criminalize the person. And our job, as I see it, as citizens interested in freedom, is to overcome all three. And the method of overcoming these tactics of oppression are, first of all, rational discussion. That's our primary function as free, independent citizens in a democratic society. Rational discussion of the issues and exposition and demonstration of what the facts are, because otherwise people don't know. The vast majority of Canadians don't know anything about what happened to James Keekstra, Malcolm Ross, or Paul Fromm, except from a really distorted media image. Then we have to have nonviolent action, and by that I mean education about the problem, such as I think perhaps has been undertaken here today in discussions about freedom of speech. Mutual support and recognition and tolerance of each other. I mean tolerance of rational discussion by our opponents as well. Tolerance of differences that might exist between myself and others who share my views about freedom of speech but might not share my political views. Tolerance in the sense of mutual support for anyone who is under attack, and keeping our sanity in what is becoming an increasingly insane world. First of all, why are we in this state? I think largely it's the result of our media. Major media in Canada are not independent, and they stifle dissent, first among themselves, by the same three tactics: isolation, alienation, and criminalization. They don't go as far as they might with others in respect to the last item, but the isolation and alienation of media that don't, quote, toe the line, I find quite obvious. Little magazines like BC and Alberta Report are isolated. They are not regarded as mainstream, and they have a difficult time in the media in Canada. I find the media generally act as bloodhounds for the government in support of such policies as multiculturalism, liberalism, pro-abortion, pro-homosexualism, pro-government control. There's a stifling uniformity and very little independence. There will be some future issues in this coming year that I think you should be aware of. The McAleer case goes to the Supreme Court of Canada in December the 10th, 1997. On that occasion, the issue will be whether a judge's order can ban the communication of a telephone answering machine in another country to which Mr. McAleer referred in his own telephone in Canada. It's becoming Orwellian, it's becoming so frighteningly totalitarian that even though the courts held the order of the judge who banned those messages without a hearing was wrong, they still upheld the order which would send Mr. McAleer to jail for disobeying what the court held was an invalid order. The argument that I'll advance on Mr. McAleer's behalf December 10th is that the order was not just invalid, it was a nullity. A court can't tell you not to breathe and then hold you in contempt for failing to obey that improper order. And yet that seems, in my view, the way that the law now stands. Paul Fromm is going on with his difficulties before the Peel Board of Education, and I gather now running for that very Board of Education in the upcoming election, but whatever happens there will happen. His case will go on through the courts. It'll take a long time and cost him a great deal of money, as all these things do. Mr. Zundel's difficulties before the Human Rights Commission or Tribunal, I don't really think there's that much difference between the two, will be going on now and will continue till probably June 1998 unless the courts intervene and stop it. Mr. Collins is now before the BC Human Rights Tribunal, and as I said in our George Orwell free speech dinner not long ago, he is going to face soon Nietzsche's ire, because she's now reserved her judgment, and I'm sure she'll be coming down with a judgment which will try to silence the North Shore News and cost them a further hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you know, essentially what this does is target prosecution of prominent people, with the impact being that silence is what most of us will take as a safer course. Naturally, not everybody has $200,000 to defend themselves, and that hasn't even got to court. Clearly, this will result in great terror in the media generally, a desire to conform to the dictates of political correctness as seen by the left wing in our time. The new wave of hate crimes trials are now about to get underway, and the Pressler civil action is about to go to trial in November 1997, where, for once, Eileen Pressler decided to take legal recourse against her persecutor, Mr. David Lethbridge, who had worked together with CHBC-TV in Kelowna to present an image of their home that implied they were occupying a compound with a carpeted barn with circular stairs, multiple phone jacks, and all the equipment for right-wing rallies, independent telecommunication system, a lot of statements which they have said to the court are defamatory, and we will decide, or we will have decided by the end of November whether that is true or not. Malcolm Ross is likewise suing his detractors in the New Brunswick Teachers Federation, who held a conference where he was publicly ridiculed, and cartoons involving him with a pencil stuck basically up his rectum. I hate to say it, but that's the way it was presented. It was flashed on the screen for all the teachers of New Brunswick to laugh at him. And if that isn't defamatory, I don't know what is. That's going to have to be decided in February 1998. But I say this again. Resistance to oppression is obedience to God. Our duty to ourselves, to our children, to future generations, to preserve our freedom, is to stand up to this challenge. This is our time of greatest challenge. This is the time which will test the mettle of our souls. We have to stand together for the principles of free speech, and we must not abandon anyone who is under attack. We must unite our strength and ignore our weakness. And the enemies of freedom want to deny many people the right to speak. Our duty is to hear directly from them and support their right to speak, though we may not agree with what they say, and we may not believe what they believe. Their cases are all pieces of a puzzle. Put them together and you see the ugly face of oppression by government and the destruction of our rights. It is our function and our duty not to wait until all of our freedom has been taken away before we fight. Our duty to fight rationally, coherently, and positively is to take that action now while we still can, before we've lost the freedom that our forefathers fought for. Our function is to do everything in our power by peaceful means, using freedom of assembly and freedom of speech in our country now, and through our small newsletters and other means of communication, to arouse people to defend freedom of speech. I hope that Mr. Butler, who I believe is here from will be there from Australia with you, will find some encouragement from what we do in the future to defend free speech in Canada. I think we owe a debt of gratitude to those who have stood up to oppression before, and indeed, as they have, stood up for what they believed, rightly or wrongly. Without such people, we will never have freedom of speech, and we will never find truth. And we need those two commodities very vitally in this time of trouble, of darkness, and of confusion. If we are not to see Peters and Angelas threatening other people with what happens to others if you stand up for what you believe, if we are not to have the destruction of our freedom and Grant Bristow's invading the privacy of all of our organizations so that the secret police spies on everyone and we're all afraid to talk to anyone around us, if we're not to have Carney Nerlens running around inciting people to do things for the cameras so that subsequently they can be deprived of their property, if we are not to see people losing their jobs because of what they believe and having left-wing terrorists run around giving us bombs in the mail, if we are not to have those things, we must be brave, and we must be consistent, and we must never, never surrender to the oppressive forces that are arrayed against us in this time of greatest tribulation. I hope that you realize that it is not possible to achieve protection of our rights by just going on as if nothing was happening. It's my view, of course, that some people say they want to take our country back. I, for one, don't think that's possible. I don't want a country back that has surrendered my rights, my freedoms, and my heritage as far as this one has. I want a new country, an independent nation of Western Canada, and I always will desire that end. I respect those who don't share my views in this regard. I respect those, like the League of Rights, who have tried to reform Canada. But let not our political differences divide us on one essential truth. Freedom is essential for the maintenance of our security, our property, our culture, and indeed our identity. With these thoughts, I hope that you and I in the future can meet, and we will be sharing in a common cause, the preservation of our freedom and our heritage. Thank you very much.